I was talking to, last time I talked about the kind of rebirth of classical Lutheran education in this movement that you're a part of. I learned that Melinda Heine, who started with her husband Bill, and like a lot of the curricular work, and like she was the first teacher and the only teacher, I think, at the Pagosa Springs. They started that before they knew about Doug Wilson. They were already doing classical education before, starting a year before they discovered what Doug Wilson was doing and bringing, the lost tools of learning and the Trivium and all to our work. And so they really are pioneers, and what we do as Lutherans really is not just tied to that particular movement. We're already discovering it. And she also said that it was independently of what Pastor Shively was doing in Fort Wayne. And so both schools opened on the exact same year. Well, today I talk about classical Lutheran education, the future. Now, prophets in the Old Testament who predicted something that did not come to pass were given the death penalty. So I always want to be cautious about predicting what's going to happen. And I'm not really going to do that as such. I do want to say, though, that a lot of Christians are very pessimistic right now. I loved last night hearing a dear colleague, Christian Kopp's paper that Pastor that was read to us, and the Benedict option. Things are so bad. Christianity has lost all the culture wars. All we can do is separate, like the Benedictine monks in the Dark Ages that I was telling you about, keep civilization alive until everything falls apart. And again, it's a good book, the Benedict option, and you get a lot of benefit from it, but I think it may be too pessimistic. The thing is, false ideas tend to self-destruct. And we certainly see that with progressive education. I mean, it started fine and it carried the way and even won over our Lutheran, our synod, and there didn't seem anything wrong with it, but it kept pushing and going to one extreme after another, to the point that it's failing to teach reading and writing and arithmetic. And even the progressive educators are admitting that now. No, let's find a new way. We've got to be more progressive. Let's be more radical. Maybe we shouldn't be teaching these things. It's oppressive. But that's the trajectory of falsehood. Remember, God created the world. Everything that exists is His. Reality is going to be on our side. And I'm seeing this in other things, the academic world, pushing academic freedom, the freedom of inquiry, and taking it so far that today the universities have all but squelched academic freedom and intellectual inquiry. And they're the most rigorous, narrow-minded, anti-intellectual people you'll ever meet. People that establish prestigious university a lot of times. Again, I said these give such opportunity for recovering what education is supposed to be. But I see this in other things. The sexual revolution, sexual freedom, sex is no big deal. Why are you making such a big... Now that has developed to the Me Too movement, where all of a sudden women are seeing how they've been victimized and used and abused, and how all of these things is working against them and they're not taking it. And I think that's a beautiful development. And it's the self-destruction of the sexual revolution. I mean, we see this in lots of areas. I mean, feminism. Now the feminists are having to figure out, well, wait a minute, what do we do about the transgender movement, where a lot of the women are men, and they're so confused. It's so almost a fun, entertaining thing to read the agonizing over this movement, and we see this a lot. So we should not lose heart. Christian liberty looked like it was in terrible, terrible shape, and it might be quenched completely. And there's a real fear of that just recently. But a couple of Supreme Court rulings on religious liberty are very significant, more so than we realize when you read the rulings and how opposition to same-sex marriage is now a protected position. And now the Supreme Court seems to be in good hands. And all of a sudden, the threats to religious liberty, while real, and it'll happen on a personal basis, it looks better. So I think the future is not something that, and of course, ultimately for Christians, we know the end. We have the spoiler. We know how it's all going to end. And it's going to end with the total victory of Christ and our own resurrection and glorification. But what do I mean, the future? Basically, I want to talk about where we are now in this particular movement and what needs to happen next. Because this has just started, and we have a long ways to go. I want to suggest some areas where sort of some of the next steps for classical education, especially classical Lutheran education. I mean, first of all, we need to realize that classical education is more than just the Trivium. Like a lot of us define classical education as, well, it's the Trivium, and so our lower grades, they're memorizing, and since most of our schools are just lower grades, that's kind of what they're doing, and maybe we need to be doing some more on the lower grades of the other aspects of classical education, and we certainly need to carry it forward. One of the big problems is that children get a really good foundation in our schools, our grammar school levels, but then they're back to progressive education in high school, and that's maybe where they need it most. Now, but things are happening. Wittenberg Academy, now there is a Lutheran high school, an online Lutheran high school. I love how classical education works with, the newest technology that's possible to use that for, classic values, classic education. And so here in our Lutheran Church, we have, I think we should do everything we can to have, flesh and blood high schools and curriculum for homeschoolers on that level. But again, there's an option with Wittenberg Academy, and I hope that continues to grow and more people discover that. Here's an example. There's hundreds, thousands of years, really, of heritage in the classical educational tradition. And it's like a treasure chest. And there's a lot of work just exploring that and then finding things in it that we can bring back and apply to our teaching today. One example would be the progymnosmata, the way they taught writing in the classical approach. And that's been discovered, adapted, and it's an incredible way to teach writing and creativity and effective writing communication skills. How many of you use some version of this? Okay. Several of you have and are, but again, I commend it to you. Look into this. This is something you can use on the lower level. And this is another powerful tool from the classical education tradition. And I have the feeling there's a lot more things like that I'm not aware of and other people are, but it's just waiting to be discovered. I think that will happen. And again, keep in mind, classical education is about the heart as well as the mind. Some of the classical schools I've seen, and again, I'm not thinking of Lutheran ones, but some of the Doug Wilson schools I've seen, they're very intellectual, they're very logic-oriented. In fact, like medieval scholasticism, taking logic and making everything to logic to a fault. I see that in some of the Christian schools today. It's all about logic and understanding and syllogisms and debating, and that's good, that's part of it. But remember, a classical approach doesn't just take one aspect, it wants to do it all. So yes, logic, also grammar, but also rhetoric. And I appreciated, again, I'm seeing so many signs of what I'm advocating starting to happen, even in this conference. I appreciate the folks at Emmanuel in Virginia are talking about teaching self-governance, teaching children to do freely what they should. Instead of just giving rules, punishment, to take the opportunity of, yes, you have rules, that they understand them and they understand the principles behind them, and they do them from the heart, not just because they're forced to do it. And of course, that's also the root of the gospel motivation, where we do what we should out of love for our neighbor because of Christ's love for us, as opposed to just a legalistic kind of approach, which again, I see in a lot of classical schools, frankly, not Lutheran ones, but I see that when I go to a Doug Wilson school. And again, I don't mean to put him down. I mean, he's a great pioneer of what we're about. But as Lutherans, again, we have a bigger, richer, and I think theologically more valid approach. But again, teach the heart as well as the mind. And so the use of literature and art and music, these things can get at that part of the human being, and those are important for a classical education. Consider the content of the classical Lutheran curriculum, Latin, philosophy, moral formation, catechesis. And again, I think we have that, but again, that's there's so much we could do with that. But also remember the purpose of the classical Lutheran curriculum as the Lutheran educators at the time formulated it. I think this is Johann Sturm's, how he described the purpose of this school. But I think it derives also from something Melanchthon said. He says, what we want to do, the purpose is to cultivate a wise and eloquent piety. Piety, I mean, that's above all, the relationship with Christ, their faith, but a wise piety. Okay, you can have a piety and not be wise, and you certainly will go to heaven, and that's the main thing. But sometimes you're not going to be very effective in the world, or in communicating the gospel to other people, or in living a life that in the most productive way. But a wise piety and an eloquent piety. Piety that can express itself, can express it to others. and this idea of eloquence. Again, that gets into rhetoric. And again, as I said, Luther and Wittenberg, what they did was emphasize rhetoric, not just in public speaking, okay, that's part of it, not just in writing well, that's part of it, but in that whole dimension of creative application, where you can use these things and drawing on eloquence that inspires and illuminates, and being able to do that yourself. Okay, we need to do some more with the eloquence side. And again, I think there's more treasures yet to be discovered. And again, at this conference, one of the elements of the real classical education was gymnastics. In fact, Plato classified gymnastics as one of the liberal arts. And sports come from classical education. I'm sorry, they just do. The classical schools in England, Eton and Herod and all of those, that was where, football was invented. The earlier forms of football that became football in the different forms, soccer, American football, Aussie League football, that came out of those boarding schools. Baseball, again, evolved out of cricket and other things. And it was thought that the principle of a sound mind and a sound body. And sports are classical because you're cultivating your human powers for their own sake. That's what you're doing when you learn Latin and when you learn history and when you learn literature and all these other things. You're building up the human being, and we're embodied creatures. We're part of the creation. And so they also, all the way from Plato on down, taught you should do that physically. And so games and sports and physical fitness were part of it. Again, now today, the public school, the secularists have taken over and I think corrupted sports in maybe a fatal way. I mentioned how bad the universities have gotten and the way they restrict learning, and in their radical left-wing ideology. So if the taxpayers knew what was being taught at their schools that they paid a lot of money for, they would rise up in arms and make changes. But as long as the football team is doing well, that's what the general public thinks of when they think of University of Texas or my alma mater, University of Oklahoma, Sooners. And so you can see how sports are being used as to hide behind some of the things going on at the universities. We don't want that, but it certainly is valid to keep alive that spirit of a sound mind and a sound body, and the classical approach to the body as well. Now, here's something that's very important. We need to go beyond the lost tools of learning. Dorothy L. Sayers wrote a great essay, been applied, really helpful. But not only is that not all of classical education, I think sometimes we take what she said maybe in some insufficient ways, and even she gets at least one thing completely wrong. Okay. What she got wrong. Okay, first of all, the Trivium is not only developmental. Grammar, logic, rhetoric, we think of those as stages, and then that's helpful, and that is, and you can see the developmental process, and good, let's continue to use that. But it's not only developmental. Okay, grammar, logic, and rhetoric are also subjects. And so we do need to learn English grammar, Latin grammar. logic, that's a subject. You can learn logic. Rhetoric is a subject. You can learn to speak effectively and to write effectively. We mustn't neglect those as subjects. Also, I made the point that the Trivium shows the elements of learning any subject. In other words, every field has its grammar. Driver's ed. There are certain basic things you need to know about the rules of the road and how to turn your car on and where the brake is, and you need to know things. That's the grammar of driving. But there's also a logic to driving. You need to understand what's going on and be aware of your surroundings, and you need to think like a driver. And finally, there's the rhetoric of driver's ed, where you actually drive. You get behind the wheel and you drive. You practice. You do it yourself. You go where you want to go. And whether it's history, again, there's basic things of history. You need to know the presidents and the facts and the names and dates. Let's not neglect that. But then there's a logic of history, understanding what is going on in history. What are the issues? What's the big picture? And then there's a rhetoric of history. How can we apply what we've learned from history, say, to today? Okay. Again, in literature and the arts, yes, learn art, learn the basics of art, and then also learn to understand art, understand the art that's around us. And then the rhetoric is where you do the art. Sometimes we start, the extent of our art education is just doing it. But that's good, that's the rhetoric of it, but let's not forget the other parts. Anyway, I think we can do more with the Trivium than we have been, frankly. But her big mistake is misconstruing the Quadrivium. She said that the Quadrivium represents the subjects that you learn. Okay, the Trivium, the tools of learning, the Quadrivium are the subjects. And yes, back then they had astronomy and music and stuff, and that's what they studied, but that's the content area. So for us, learn the tools, then you go to college or wherever, and then you learn your subjects using the tools of learning. Well, but that's not the Trivium. That's not the Quadrivium. The Quadrivium are liberal arts just as much as the Trivium is. The subjects are in the sciences, the knowledge bases. Again, we're talking about that, the natural science, moral science, theological science. But the Quadrivium is an art. That is, it deals with cultivating powers of the mind. Now, the Trivium teaches mastery of language, and that is fundamental. I think that is even more important than other things we could do. So what you're doing in your grammar schools, you really want to master language. Knowing the language, thinking with the language, and expressing yourself with the language. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The Quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, it's about mastery of mathematics. Mathematics. Now, here's what Boethius, an early figure of the early church, who did a lot of the thinking and systematizing about the Christian approach to liberal arts. Here's what he said about the Quadrivium. He said, arithmetic is about numbers. Okay, obviously. Geometry is about numbers in space. Okay, like squares and circles. It's numbers operating in the spatial realm. Music is numbers in time. Okay, think about that. Music is numbers in time. Okay, what is rhythm? It's numbers. What is the notes? Again, if you study musical theory, it's all math, isn't it? Harmony is about proportions. And it's mathematical. Harmony is a mathematical concept. And to think of numbers in time as it unfolds. Music is an art form based on time. Because we hear one note. I mean, we think that time, passes. There's a moment, then that moment's gone. Now we're in another moment. Past is gone. Future doesn't exist. Music really disproves that. Because somehow we can perceive music. There's a note, and there's another note, and yet somehow we can perceive it as a whole. So we can perceive an actual melody, right? It's incredible human power. Augustine writes about music as almost a proof of the existence of eternity, that we live not just in time but in eternity. And you can tell that because we're able to experience music. Anyway, music, of course, is aesthetics and art and rhetoric. But notice how in the classical mind, there's no opposition between mathematics and the arts. The good, the true, the beautiful are all one, ultimately. It's our progressive Schleiermacher, Friedrich Wilhelm III. What he did, they made all specialize. Nothing has anything to do with anything else. The whole point of classical education is to bring things together and relate them to each other. Astronomy is numbers in space and time. Numbers in space. You can calculate how to fire an object to hit the moon, how to navigate in space. It's numbers. But also time, because the moon keeps changing and you have to hit it where it's going to be at a certain point. It's all mathematics. And of course, they were doing things like calculating when the next eclipse would be. Yeah, that'd be a good class project. I have no idea how you would do that, but that's what the classical schools did. Wouldn't it be something to recover that? I mean, notice how powerful this is for science. Science has the prestige today, but the problem is math is not being taught. I mean, it's taught so poorly in progressive education today. Kids cannot do math. Again, I'm so tickled to see classical educators recovering math. Again, we had a workshop, this conference, Pastor Gaub talked about teaching math. And again, that kind of thing is what we need to do more and more of, and integrate it with everything else. Again, recovering a classical approach to mathematics. And what mathematics shows, and the reason it's especially important to a classical education, it shows the connection of mind to reality. And again, mathematics is purely a mental, I read about this, they call it a mental construction. It's mental. There's no numbers. These are not factual things in the external world. It's a mental construction, and then lo and behold, it completely accords with the real world outside the mind on every level. From the subatomic particles of quantum physics to black holes of the galaxy, mathematics shows there's a mind behind the universe. we creationists, love to, work with intelligent design. Here's something that you can't explain by evolution. Here's this case. How would you explain this? It's so ordered, so complex, it can't be explained randomly. But it isn't just that there's this thing or that thing. Everything discloses an order, a mental order, evidence of mind. Mathematics. That mathematics works proves, one, there is order in the universe. People today say, oh, there's no meaning in the universe. The universe is random. We have to create our own meaning. No. Have you ever studied math? And this connection of mind to reality is kind of what classical education is about, kind of what education the whole is about. Something that today secularists have forgotten. Yeah, math shows there are objective absolutes. There are no absolutes. That's the slogan of the postmodern era. Well, how about the speed of light, according to Einstein? That's an absolute. What about the geometric laws? What about number? They're absolutes, ones that we don't make up. It's mathematics. Mathematics is related to beauty, because beauty has to do with proportion, harmony, structures, and again, there's just some fascinating work done on even natural beauty, how certain mathematical concepts are behind the beauty of a flower, of a tree, or of the galaxy, or of architecture and poetry. And again, those are really good things to get into because they help integrate. I mean, that's part of what we're trying to achieve, to help our students see how everything is connected to everything else in God's design. And again, the integration of knowledge. What does it mean to teach mathematics classically? Well, I think there are a lot of people working on this today, and not enough of a mathematician to even be up on them all. I would suggest that as we think about how to teach math, we can apply the Trivium. There's a grammar, logic, and rhetoric of mathematics. Again, the grammar of math, learn your multiplication tables. Learn your math facts. Learn your formulas. These are the grammar of math. But that's where a lot of us stop. I mean, Saxon math, that can do that. They get the basics. But, and that's a lot better than what they'll probably get in the public school. But it stops short of what we want them to learn from and about mathematics. So then help them to think about math, to understand it. Most young people hate it because they don't understand it. It's just something to memorize. I'll never use this. Anytime a child says, I'll never use this, you have a heretic on your hands. That's the heresy of pragmatism. You don't test truth or the value of something because of how useful it is. I mean, that's the mindset that says, yes, I should get an abortion because my pregnancy comes at a bad time in my life, and it would be more practical if I wait until I, finish school or something. And that mindset of using things, and that's how you determine value, that is from the devil. And yet that is a dominant way of thinking today. I'm not saying that every manifestation of it is demonic, but that's where it leads to. And so that's one thing, a philosophy, a worldview today that we have to be battling as classical educators, as Christians. But then, to understand it, and then the rhetoric to use it. You can use it, but not just in a bally pragmatic way. You can do things with it. You can do things with it that predict things that will happen in the world. And here you get into the scientific application of it. So if you teach the grammar, logic, and rhetoric of math, I think that your students will have a better appreciation for it. And again, via the Quadrivium. I'm not sure what that would look like exactly, but arithmetic, obviously, geometry. Yeah, geometry. It also teaches you logic. That's how I learned logic, was by having to do proofs in my geometry course. I had to prove the theorems, and that taught me logic. Music, again, to teach the math of music, and astronomy. And you can apply that to other sciences where you're taking something, data from the outside world, and then analyzing it mathematically. Okay, the ancients had astronomy. That was what they did. We can apply that to chemistry or biology or other things. It wouldn't hurt us to actually try astronomy, see what we could do with that. But it's a way to cultivate math. One thing I thought about, read the original sources. When you're studying geometry, read Euclid. A lot of times when you're studying calculus, read, who is it, Leibniz? Or Lutheran, the great Lutheran mathematician. I find sometimes the original writers are a lot clearer than the textbooks that try to explain what they've done. I don't know. Think of other ideas. And this is something, now STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. And people play this off against liberal arts. And they're saying in colleges, oh, you're taking liberal arts. Oh, that's a waste of time. That's a waste of a thing. You need to take STEM classes. Well, again, the assumption is that liberal art just means humanities, which it doesn't. And properly, and I would say that progressive education does a poor job of teaching science and technology and engineering and math. Do you know why you call a tech support line and you're talking to somebody from India? Okay, England has done a better job of keeping classical education alive than most other countries. And it's not, there are elements of progressive in that it's not the full-blown, but it's more of a classical approach than you'll typically find in America. Where the British Empire went, they took the British school system. And to this day, the former British colonies like India and Singapore and others, their empire went around the world, tend to be far more classical in their approaches than what we are. We had our independence and we cast off the king and went our own way. But they are getting a better education in STEM subjects through a more of a classical approach. All this stuff is too hard for a lot of our students. Math's too hard. Give me something easy. Science, engineering. They want to use the technology, but and some are very good at it, of course, but you don't need very many of those. We all can use it without understanding it. Again, in a classic way, science what we call science today fits with the natural science, knowledge of nature. It includes physics, astronomy, again, math applied to nature. That was what it was. Technology, you can see, is the rhetoric of natural science. And you can learn about science, learn the elements, learn how to do science, and then and the logic, learn how to understand science and understand nature, how the natural laws all work together. The rhetoric of science is technology. What can we do with science? Applying creativity, the creative human mind that we've cultivated with literature and arts and everything else, but now has this realm also. That's where invention comes from. Technology is just as creative as the arts. Technology is not science. Technology is the creative application of science and making something new, creating something that didn't exist. And again, that's a glorious thing. That's a classical thing. Engineering, you can think of that as the rhetoric of mathematics. Using mathematics to solve problems, to build a bridge that won't collapse. That takes math. To design an airplane that will fly faster. That takes math. And it also takes that creativity of the rhetorics. And another thing that I see as one of the next steps is to recover classical Lutheran education in higher education. In many ways, our grammar schools are far ahead of our universities in recovering and applying and exploring all that you can do with classical liberal arts education. I'm not talking just about in a Lutheran context, just in general. Christian schools, a lot of which have gone classical, far ahead. Most Christian colleges and universities have not. Okay, but some are farther along than others. I taught at Patrick Henry College, where we are doing this in I think, some very, very important ways. But this is, I think, as classical education spreads, it now needs to spread upwards into the higher education. And I think that's starting to happen too. And I talked about the German university model, which is all about specialization, all about the scientific approach to everything, including theology, founded by the enemy of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, King Wilhelm III, father of the Prussian Union, father of the Prussian University. Now, this became very prestigious in the 19th and into the 20th century, and it spread into America. And all the land-grant colleges and universities that were opening up adopted the German Research University model. But by the middle of the 20th century, 1950s, 1960s, we were realizing that wasn't enough. You know, the lower levels had all those books, Johnny can't read, Johnny can't write, Johnny can't know right from wrong, he can't do this, he can't do that. It was sort of the discussion of Johnny, now that he's grown up and gone to college, you know, John is highly educated, but he doesn't really know hardly anything. No, he knows a very small area of knowledge that he's specialized into. Okay, maybe he knows a whole lot about maybe something really, semiconductors or something. He knows a lot about that. And maybe he can even get a job in the electronics field and help develop semiconductors. But he doesn't know history. He doesn't know where he came from. He doesn't know anything about politics. He doesn't know anything about, anything other than narrow little field. And so there was a change in American higher education, which is very much for the best. You can have specialization without education. The key figure here was Robert Maynard Hutchins. He was the president of the University of Chicago, which is one of the first schools in America to adopt the German university model. But he was also at Columbia, and he and others came up with a concept of including liberal arts requirements with the specialization. The specialization was doing good things for us, advancing science in many areas and equipping people for the workforce. But to include in that a liberal arts requirement. Okay, this is why probably when most of you went to college, you had your major, that was your specialty. But you also had to take history and a math course and philosophy and things that you maybe thought you needed to get out of the way so you could do what you're really wanting there, what you're really there for, right? Take education courses, be a teacher. Well, this comes from that, and it was a brilliant solution in many ways, because Johnny could come to college and get something, at least, of the liberal arts, bigger education for human freedom, and specialize in something. Okay. Again, it was a brilliant development in American higher education, and made it very, very formidable. So the American higher education really did become the best in the world. Mortimer Adler was another figure who worked with Hutchins. And Adler did so much to recover the liberal arts heritage and what it meant and how to teach it and what it entails. So even today, there are different types of liberal arts requirements. And one of them is the menu approach. Okay, you take one history course, and you can pick from all these different classes. Pick one from column A. You need a literature course. Pick one from column B. You need a math course. Okay, see which one fits your schedule that well. You need a science. You're given a menu, and you select from it. That's probably how most of us had it, right? And again, that can be good, but the problem is no two people will graduate having had the same courses. And it's impossible to determine, okay, what do you need to know? And so it becomes a kind of a haphazard. You can give yourself a good education, I think, if you pick carefully, but even then, educationally, I think that's not the best way to do the liberal arts. Another way, more promising, perhaps interdisciplinary courses, where you're trying to intentionally relate different fields. And again, that's what the liberal arts approach does so well. And so this you will find that usually as part of the liberal arts, or as they say, general education requirement. Then there's the true core. Now, this is what we had at Patrick Henry. And some of my students here, I'm so proud of, graduates of Patrick Henry. They're now teaching at Emmanuel in Alexandria. Now this is what I was working on as provost there, to determine what classes everybody will take, so that everybody that comes to Concordia, whatever their major, whatever field they go in, they've read the same great books. They've been exposed to the same great ideas. They've been taught a certain thing. So even in the later courses, the professors know what they've already read and can draw on what they took in the literature class, what they took in the history class. And it allows knowledge to build in a more effective, and I would say a more classical way. So it isn't just haphazard. There are very few schools that use a true core, but it's very powerful educationally. Another type is the great books. Great to hear how Concordia Irvine is, Concordia Mequon is, my old school where I used to be, is incorporating great texts into certain courses. And again, it isn't that there's just one collection of great books, but it's very beneficial for people to have been exposed to some of the great ideas. So that's good now, although now liberal arts requirements have fallen into hard times. They're getting cut back more and more and more. Some have pretty much eliminated them. But again, this is how the American university at its strongest developed. So it has a virtue both of liberal art and specialization. However, if I can say, there are a few things that are missing in the university approaches. Again, it creates the impression that the liberal arts means humanities. And in many contexts, you hear liberal arts, you think, oh, okay, history, philosophy, literature, all that impractical stuff. No, there's 7 liberal arts, and history and literature are not even one of them, although again, they have an important function. But this is a real problem. Teaching the liberal arts with German university-style specialization. What has happened with these liberal fields like literature, like history, is that they're studied as specialties with all the scientific specialization, and that's because of the professors, that's how they learned it. And so instead of studying history in a liberal way, or literature in a liberal, that is freeing, all-encompassing way, you stay as a narrow little specialty. Which means that turns a lot of students off, because if that's not the specialty they're interested in, they won't like it. It makes it irrelevant, and it defeats the purpose of a liberal arts requirement. Okay. And so, in some cases, universities have eliminated the liberal arts requirement. Maybe it's not that bad of a thing because they were really damaging the liberal arts. They ceased to be liberal arts courses, and professors, I have to teach a history course. Well, I'm going to teach my specialty. And so that become part of the menu of courses. Instead of taking a course in, American history, you can choose in the menu a course of Native American women's village cooking techniques. Something so narrow, and that's the history you've learned. If you pick that, if that's what fit in your schedule, you don't know anything about, Washington or the Founding Fathers or the Federalist Papers. But that's kind of how it's devolved. Again, liberal arts is a master of language, plus mathematics, plus humanities, plus integration. And again, the use of classical teaching methods is something else that universities are way behind in. All right, we're running out of time. I think we can reconsider it. And again, I'm so happy that now we have our Concordia colleges joining with us, with Kella and Irvine and Chicago and Mequon, and I think others are interested too in this movement that we're doing. I would suggest that we might consider classical Lutheran seminaries. Have our seminaries been influenced by Schleiermacher's approach to seminary education, turning it into a narrow academic specialty rather than the queen of the sciences that involves everything. Historically, Lutheran seminaries, they wanted classically trained students to turn into pastors. Really gotten away from that now. What would it be like? The classical Lutheran pre-sim program look like? Now, pre-sim programs, they specialize in theology from their freshman year. And so they say theology, and then they go to seminary, and then get more theology. Does Pastor John, why Pastor John can't deal with people? I don't know. Johnny goes to seminary. How might a seminary curriculum itself employ a classical Lutheran approach? Classical Lutheran education is to equip Christians to love and serve their neighbors in their vocation in this world. That's ultimately what we're doing. Not just in the workplace, but in the family. That's something else. We're so focusing on the workplace. Are we teaching our students to grow up to be good husbands and wives, good fathers and mothers? Their family is going to be a bigger part of their lives than their work. And it's going to be more crucial to their happiness and their effectiveness when they're adults and any job they might get. And yet so often in our education we neglect that part, more important vocations. The church, are we teaching them to be good church members, good communicant members, good elders, good Sunday school teachers, good, again, that's part of their vocations in the world. Teach them to be good citizens in the state, to be free citizens. And finally, to have faith in Christ for a future with Him that will never end. I close with this painting just because I stumbled across it and love it. This is by Fritz von Ude, Lutheran painter, 19th century. Are we teaching Lutheran artists? Do we even know who the Lutheran artists are? Well, maybe this is something we could work on too. But this is Come Lord Jesus Be Our Guest. And it is so great at painting ordinary, here's a little peasant family. Jesus is their guest at their little meal. This is a message, I think, too, of classical education, that Jesus is near us. God is not just the God of deism, far above, looking down on us. He is present. He's present in the world, the creation that He made, and the world that He governs, in the vocations that we have. And He's here with this family at their meal. So thank you, everybody. God bless you in your work. Thanks for coming to this conference, and I can't wait to see what the future holds for us.